All right, I want to welcome you to week 6, the Q&A podcast for what happened at First Baptist. This is our next to last week. That is to say that next week will be our very last week for this limited run podcast. And what we are doing at the end of every week is taking your questions. If you have questions about this week or any week, you can send them in to whathappened@fbcjax.com, and those questions will be received by Spencer Harmon, our Nocatee campus pastor, who is with me right now.
It's good to be back this week after another week of podcasts. This week, we talked about the theme of stay in our main story podcast. And then also during the leadership podcast, we talked about mistakes I made, which you were talking about mistakes you made as you were walking through these hard days at First Baptist. And so what I want to talk about at the beginning, where we had some of our listeners write in, is you talk about in these podcasts a lot of personal attacks that were made on you. But one of the more painful parts of the podcast over the last couple of episodes, and even in these episodes, is the attacks that came to your family. You talk about attacks, your wife lost friends, your kids lost friends. And we had one listener write in and they asked how you and your wife navigated this when you guys were in the thick of it. So the listener wrote in and asked, how did you separate these roles that you have of being pastor and pastor's wife from the roles of being mom and dad? Could you just talk about, maybe let us peek behind the curtain of the Lambert home and how all this worked out for you guys as you're walking through intense personal pain for you, but also on your kids?
Yeah, so the thing that's complicated about this is that being a parent is biblically prior to being a pastor. That is to say, that you are a parent matters more and is more important than that you are a pastor, such that the Apostle Paul will tell Timothy that you are qualified or not to be a pastor based on whether you are succeeding as a parent. So you have to prioritize your role as a parent. But then the question is, okay, so now I'm a parent, but I'm parenting in this pastoral context where everything is in a mess. Everything is going wrong. And we have always in our home been open books. We have always operated by the creed that we want our kids to get their information from us. We don't ever want them to think that there's an area that's off limits or some information that's off limits, because what happens when you've got kids who figure out, well, mom and dad aren't going to tell me that, then they're going to go find somebody else who's more than willing to give them that information. So we've always been open books, and we wanted to do that here. We just wanted, when we were in a hard time at church, we wanted to treat this the way we'd treated every other hard thing. Of course, there were confidential things that we could not share about with our kids. There were confidential ministry things, confidential staff and employee things that we could not share. But mostly, it was just a big mess that everybody in our family saw. I mean, they were aware of what was being said online, even when they weren't old enough to have phones. They were hearing their friends talk about it. Their friends are pulling them aside at Sunday school or on Wednesday night and talking to them there. They've got pastors and church people and their friends being mean to them and hard on them. My oldest son watched an older man in the congregation let me have it in the lobby one day, and as soon as I didn't even know he was able to see it, but as soon as it was over, he appears and said, "Daddy, why does that man hate you?" So it wasn't like there was anything to keep from them. They were seeing it. And so it was whether we were going to talk about it or not. And so we used it as an opportunity to shepherd our kids. We used it as an opportunity to talk about, here's how we pray for people who are being unkind to us. We used it as an opportunity to talk about, look, life is hard. Church is hard. Life is hard. We used it as an opportunity to talk about, hey, listen, there are some people who are really mean and unkind and unchristlike in the church, but that is not the church. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think all of our kids would say they don't have a bad view of the church. They have a very realistic view that not everybody in the church is going to be what you would hope they would be. But we wanted to, hey, you can still love the church even when people in the church are not acting like they should. I'd actually even just say, we're trying to have the podcast be for pastors and for people who are a part of ministry. This sounds like it could be a question that comes from a pastor. I would say if you're listening to this and you are in ministry, would you remember that if you are dealing with a pastor who has kids, when you object, when you do your thing, you are not just doing something towards a pastor, you're doing something towards a parent, towards a father of kids. And their kids are watching. Don't make it hard on them to love the church. Don't make them wonder whether people in the church love their dad. Of course, if you need to disagree, of course, if something's wrong, you need to talk about it. But there are Christ-like ways to do that and very godless ways to do that. And don't make it hard for a pastor's kids to believe that you're a loving person or to believe that the church is a sweet place. One of the things that when I was just shocked that people would treat my kids this way, and they'd tell their kids not to be friends with my kids, or not to do anything with, or be seen with, or communicate with my kids. One of the things that I would just say is like, okay, if I am the devil, if I'm the worst pastor in the history of Christianity, why don't you feel bad for my kids? Why don't you give them a little extra love because they're stuck with a louse like me, So try to show love and care as much as you can, because if kids are watching, the stakes could be higher than you even imagine they would be.
Okay, so we have another listener write in who's worked for Christian organizations and churches in the past, and they wanted to pop the hood on this personnel issue that you've talked about over several episodes. They wanted to hear about hiring and firing at First Baptist and letting people go. And they asked particularly about NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements. And they wanted to know, is that a biblical thing to use in a Christian organization or a church context? And has that been used in the hiring, firing process at First Baptist? And if so, why? Explain it. Maybe explain to people what an NDA even is and how they function and what we think about that here at First Baptist.
Yeah, so an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. It is something, if you use it, it is something that makes it clear that the employee is bound not to share certain information about information that they come to know because they are in the employment of the church. They've gotten kind of controversial here over the last couple of years because there are bad reasons to use NDAs. Some bad leaders, some faithless leaders use NDAs as a mechanism to have people keep their mouths shut so that bad leaders' bad deeds aren't exposed by people who saw that leader up close and are in a position to report the information. If a ministry is using an NDA to threaten people to keep their mouth shut, if they are using it to keep from having their own wickedness be exposed, then that's a problem, and we should complain against it, and we should say that is wrong. That doesn't mean there aren't good reasons to use NDAs. There are in fact good reasons to use NDAs. To ask if it's biblical, well, there's no verse in the Bible that says, if you go look up non-disclosure agreement in the concordance of your Bible, you're not going to find it in there. But what you do find is in the Bible, all through the Bible, is respect for information. And there is some information that is confidential and needs to be held close, and there's other information that should be kind of shouted from the rooftops. And so a non-disclosure agreement, when it's used in the right way, is honoring the biblical principle that some information needs to be kept close to the vest, and not everybody needs to know everything. In fact, some good reasons for a non-disclosure agreement in a ministry is, so look, at our church, at First Baptist Church, if you are on this ministry staff, you are in a position to know some of the most intimate details of people's life. You can know how much money they gave. You can know what they gave money to. You are in a position, if you've done counseling or if you've been involved maybe in an interpersonal dispute, you're able to know who's upset about what and information about their life and family details that they would never want shared out beyond their trusted ministers. So that information needs to be kept close. Another really good reason for an NDA is there can be an unequal playing field. If there has been a dismissal, if a person has been dismissed from their employment, they have a lot of freedom to say all sorts of things they want about their boss, about their church, about other ministry leaders. And the people who are in charge of the ministry, they don't have that kind of freedom. There's legal and financial and integrity reasons that you just can't come out and respond to those things. So you've got this one person who's being loud and screaming all this stuff. And because we live in a godless world, everybody just believes the loud person who's on social media. And then you've got these other people who are being quiet and can't say anything. And so one of the things that NDAs can do is they can level that playing field and say, hey, when our ministries, when your ministry ends and we part ways, everybody's going to be quiet about that. So those are two legitimate reasons to have NDAs. At First Baptist, we do have NDAs. We ask our employees to sign non-disclosure agreements. We need to be able to say to our people, to the members of our ministry, that your confidential information, nobody's going to learn about that from the members of our team because they're a part of the ministry. Now, then there's the issue, okay, well, so if the issue is that there's good reasons to have it for all those things I mentioned before, but there's also bad reasons, and bad leaders use that to cover up their bad deeds, well, how do you solve that dilemma? Well, the way we do it is our non-disclosure agreement that we ask our employees to sign at First Baptist, ask them to keep all of that information private that they come to know, ask them to handle all of that information confidentially, but there is an exception, and if for the reasons of mediation or legal proceedings, you need to expose someone who has done something wrong, that kind of exposure is not included within the bounds of the non-disclosure agreement. So we get to keep information confidential, but we're not protecting the potential bad actions of a bad leader.
Yeah. So it's a helpful tool when used for the right reasons, and that's how we use it here, but there's ways you can craft it and make it so that way it guards against some of those pitfalls.
That's correct.
Okay, so we had another pastor write in with another kind of nuts and bolts question. As they've been listening to all this sinful behavior that you've been cataloging of people being divisive in the church and all kinds of rumors and gossip being spread, we talked last week about how those things gain traction and spread among a group of people. This pastor wanted to know, how did church discipline play out at First Baptist? You know, you've got members that are being divisive. Were any of those people pursued in a church discipline-like way for their divisive behavior? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so church discipline is taught in the Bible. For those who don't know what we're talking about, this is a label that some people will put over Bible passages like Matthew 18:15-20, where Jesus gives these 3 steps towards restoration. If somebody's caught in a sin, you go talk to him privately. If he won't listen to you, then you go and you talk with him with a group. And then if he won't listen to the group, then you take it before the church. And if they won't listen to the church, then you treat him as an unbeliever. Treat them how they're acting, like somebody who's not walking with Christ. That's a biblical process. It is a process that we have utilized here at First Baptist. We were very careful with how we use. In fact, I think there was only one person. We might have engaged 2. I really don't remember, but it wasn't very many. At First Baptist, because our church is so large and there's so many people and so many moving parts, when we start to get in that process, there's a church discipline team. We have a church discipline committee that is deacons who've been trained and have some theological and biblical education about how to handle these matters. And I think there was only one person who this committee reached out to just to try to talk. So, hey, you seem like you're really upset. You're publishing a lot of stuff. Why don't we get together and talk? And this person would not do that. So even though we believe the process is biblical, even though we have made room for that process in our church, even though we use that process in our church, we did not use it in this issue and in this time. And I'll tell you, listen, you're gonna have to be careful with this in your context, because your effort at biblical fidelity, when your church is attacking you for change, when there are people in your church who are saying, hey, he's on a power trip, all he does is lie, he uses his authority for no good, like, using a church discipline process is not going to help you. It's going to make it worse. So if you think that church discipline is going to help, it might actually make it worse in the short term. And even more than that, you need to watch your heart as a leader. I know stories. I can tell you stories where pastors have used church discipline as a weapon against their people to enforce their preferences in the way they want it. Faithful people could be excused for wondering if church discipline is a cudgel that we're using to keep people who disagree with us in line. And so I'm not going to say you shouldn't use it. It's in the Bible, and Jesus doesn't say, follow Matthew 18:15-20 unless your church is under duress. He doesn't say that. But you are going to have to use your wisdom. It's not going to be this panacea that fixes the problem. It might make it worse in the short term. And the leader's heart is a real factor in, am I trying to be faithful, or am I trying to get rid of people and weaponize a biblical procedure just to have my way? I think it's really risky. And so I think in times of tumult, there's nothing you're going to be able to do that's going to make it untumultuous. And so you just got to be careful.
All right. I need your help solving a tension that I think you made in episode 6. So in episode 6, you did two things. First, you encouraged people to not have a consumer mentality with the church.
Yes.
And you say, hey, you need to stay. Like, we're thinking about churches like we think about, I forget the illustration you gave of maybe like going to the grocery store and you want this and you don't want that and you want it in this color and not in this color. But then in the same episode, you say it's okay for some people to leave when the preferences that brought them to church in the first place have been, the expectations and the board has been so reset that it's okay to leave in that moment. So those things seem contradictory. Mm-hmm. I assume you don't think they are, because you said what you said. Could you just tease that out a little bit? How can it be that we need to stay, we can't be governed by preferences, but sometimes the board gets reset and it might just be best for you to leave? Could you tease that out and help us understand how those things work together?
Yes, I think that is the tension of real life.
Okay.
So in real life, there are all sorts of rules of thumb that are mainly, typically what you should live by, and then exceptional circumstances that make that not true. So mainly, it's good if you don't inject narcotics into your arm like 6 or 8 times a day. I think most of us would agree. Like if I said, hey, I think your life will be really good if 6 or 8 times a day you are not injecting narcotics into your body, and we'd say, yes, that's really good. But then if I told you, I've had these 6 surgeries, and after those 6 surgeries, I had a lot of narcotics. I'm just telling you. I was begging for narcotics. They drilled a hole in the back of my head. Yeah. They cut open the brain envelope. They put tools up into my brain. I woke up hurting. And so I was begging them for narcotics. And you would watch these nurses scramble, and they'd come at me and they'd fill me up with narcotics, and it would feel so great. It was a wonderful gift. But then also part of the deal of leaving ICU to go to a normal room, and part of the deal of leaving a normal room to go home, is your pain management. Okay, are you able to make it without getting this kind of medicine, because you can't live like that forever. Okay, so I think this is what we're dealing with in a ministry transition. I think this is one of those exceptional circumstances to the normal way of life. And normally, we should not pick our churches as consumers. Normally, we should not do that. But there are going to be exceptional circumstances. I think ministry transitions are one of them, when we need to behave a little bit differently than normal. So I said in the podcast something like, every town, if you live in anything like a normal town, there's probably going to be at least 2 or 3 really faithful churches that you can go to. They're going to preach the Bible. They believe Jesus. But all of us pick out of all those faithful churches. Some of you are in towns where there's 20 or 30. Mm-hmm. All of us pick from those faithful churches. We pick based on preferences. To some degree, it's closer to our house. We like this guy's preaching better than the other guy's preaching. We like the music style at this one church better than the other church. And what I'm saying is that ministry transitions are times of such tumult and such revolution that we ought to cut folks some slack. We ought to cut folks some slack and just say, hey, well, normally you shouldn't be a consumer. If you picked this church out of all the faithful ones you could have picked because of some things that were peculiar to it, and now those peculiar things aren't there anymore, well, I'm not going to completely interrogate that and make this a moral issue if you decide you just can't do it anymore, or if your family's too tired, or if your kids are distracted, or if you're distracted. I'm just not going to interrogate that. And in fact, what I would say to guys is you shouldn't either. You should understand this is part of the deal. This is an extraordinary time in their life, an extraordinary time in the life of the church, and you absolutely should not throw yourself on the ground and wrap your arms around the legs of somebody that just doesn't want to be at your church anymore. That's just not what's, as we talked about, I think we talked about this last week on the podcast. God's creating a new ministry. He's creating a new audience. He's creating a new congregation. It's going to be a little bit different than it ever was before. And you should trust the Lord and probably let that happen, I think.
So the bonus episode this week, man, I think it was really helpful, really encouraging. I know you having to be really vulnerable talking about all the mistakes that you made, but I think it was really helpful and will be helpful for a lot of guys listening to it. A few minutes ago, we were talking before we hit record on this, and I told you that you totally shocked me. But what I told you was, listening to this podcast, for me personally, as someone who observed a lot of this happen, one of your friends, almost everything I've listened to so far has been things that I've either heard you talk about or I've watched happen. But there was something in this mistakes you made episode that totally shocked me. And it's the part at the very end when you say that you should have left the church because of your family. Yeah. I've never heard you say that before. I've been here for almost 5 years and I have never heard you say that. And I told you before we hit record that it just totally shocked me and I wanted to hear more about it. And I want to ask you about that because I think there are a lot of pastors that are listening to this podcast and they're always making that evaluation. Is this too much for my family? Mm-hmm. Am I doing too much? Like, do we need to get out of here? Can you just give some principles to help make that evaluate? Obviously, you had to evaluate.
Yeah.
This was too much for my family, and now we're through it, and it's okay, but I regret it.
Yes.
Could you just talk about it? How did you get there? How did you realize that? Help other pastors think about this too as they're evaluating their own families.
Yeah. So I'll tell you 3 things quick and then try to explain some of what you're bringing out. So when you're in this, I think you need to prioritize your family. I think you need to watch your family, and I think you need to trust the Lord. So prioritize your family, watch your family, trust the Lord. We are not ever allowed to sacrifice our families on the altar of ministry, as they say. We're just not allowed to do that. Again, as we talked about at the beginning, being a dad is biblically prior to being a pastor. If I fail as a dad, I'm not qualified to be a pastor. So we got to prioritize our family, and then you got to watch your family. And I was watching my family. Okay, and here's where I think I made the mistake that I now believe was an error, and that I had to go to my wife and my kids and ask them for forgiveness for, and I had to ask the Lord for forgiveness for. I think as I was watching my family, I was passively watching. So I talked about this veto that, hey, if you guys can't take it, let me know and we'll go. We don't say, hey, I'm going to beat you with this stick, and then when you scream really loud, that's when I'm going to stop.
Right.
like I shouldn't beat you with a stick, So I gave them a veto. I gave them an out. I gave them a parachute. But I think I should have been more actively pursuing their good. Now, I want to be honest. It's not as though I ever said, man, I hope they don't use the veto because I can tell this is killing them and I don't care. I'm just going to keep doing it. But I really didn't see it. The way I was thinking is, hey, if they can't do it, they're going to tell me, and then we'll really go. And then I was just trying to move on like that. I think I should have been more actively watching them and just actively going, this is a harmful situation. This is a dangerous situation. This is a crazy situation. And instead of asking them to use a veto, I should say, no, we're not doing it. It would have been very hard for me to do it. It would have been very hard for them to do it. But I think I should have done it. And then I say, trust the Lord. So I do think I made a mistake. I think I was wrong. But when I went to my wife and asked her for forgiveness on this, she said, I don't feel like you sinned against me, and I'm glad you didn't take us out. And when I went to Carson and Chloe and Connor and all of our every single one of them in our conversation said, well, I even got some eye rolls from one of them. Like, what are you talking about? Like, come on, Dad. Like, you didn't do anything. And so nobody felt harmed. But as I tried to say in the podcast, I don't think that's because I didn't harm them. I think it's because the Lord is better and wiser and infinitely more loving than I am. And what he was governing the universe in my life so that if I was thinking then the way I'm thinking now, I would have uprooted everybody. I would have said, we're going to go someplace easier. We're going to go someplace better. We're going to go someplace where this isn't going on. And it would have messed up my family in a different way. Right. So the Lord, I think, in his providence, I didn't see it. And now that I do see it, I'm able to see that, hey, he used that failure on my part for good. But listen, the whole reason for this podcast is some people have been nervous that I'm going to use this podcast to burn them. Some people are waiting, excited for me to burn people. And we keep telling them nobody's getting burned in this podcast. The reason for this podcast is to help people who have not been through what we have. Mm-hmm. And I want guys to hear me say, I wish I had taken more active care, and that I didn't was a mistake, an error that the Lord protected me from the consequences of. But I want to take everything I know, everything I've experienced, and say, you need to use a zoom lens to watch your family, and don't just assume they're going to be okay. This is high stakes. I mean, mm-hmm. they could hate you when this is over. Do you know my kids never did this? I'm so thankful to the Lord Jesus. Do you know how many people I know who have kids who said, Dad, why don't you quit? Dad, why don't you stop doing this? My friends are upset. Dad, come on. Like, they could hate you when this is over. They could hate the church when this is over. They could be suicidal when this is over. This is a high stakes reality. that we're in. And I just want to warn everybody, you need to keep a closer watch than you think you need to.
Okay, I want to double click on this one more time.
Okay.
Because I want to understand this a little bit better, and I think there's guys that are going to be asking this question. So I know right now you see things more clearly than you did then.
Yeah.
You're able to evaluate this with a lot more clarity than when you're in the fog of war.
Yes.
So let's, from the perspective you're in now, what were some of the warning signs? You were watching your family. What were some of the warning signs that you were seeing in your family that you can see now that would lead you to say, oh, that's when we should have pulled the escape latch or whatever, and we should have got out of here? What were some of the things you were seeing in your family? What were some of the things that was happening to your family that would help other pastors as they're saying, okay, I don't know, how do I evaluate this? I'm watching them. Everybody knows their own family, but maybe just share a little bit personally that the things you were seeing them walk through, that as you look back on it, you would say, that was probably a moment that would have been appropriate to leave.
Yeah. So one, I'll start just with myself. I mentioned in the podcast, in the one on mistakes, about how I was just busy constantly. Listen, life's busy, work's hard. Ministry ought to be hard too. I mean, we got plenty of people in our churches who are working real hard. I'm not a big fan of people who whine about how hard ministry is. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about 18, 20-hour days, 7 days a week for months at a time. That's insane. So I was absent without leave as a dad for so much of the time. And then when I was home, I mean, I would be sobbing. I mean, I can remember coming in and sitting on the couch with Lauren and putting my face in her lap and sobbing. I mean, ugly cry. I can't do this anymore. My wife is seeing this like crushed spirit on my part. My kids are seeing this. And that's just a warning sign when like dad is breaking down. Oh my goodness. So that's a warning sign for me. And then I would say it was the relational costs with the others, with Lauren, her tears over lost relationships, her tears over seeing horrible things that were said about me. And she's wanting to defend me online. And I'm just like, we are not doing that. You listen, you can go online right now. You can find people defending folks online. Lamberts aren't going to do that. Honey, put your phone down. Don't do it. And so she's sobbing and frustrated. My kids, the one kid that managed to dodge most of the bullets was Connor. He was so young. He wasn't paying much attention. But the older two, Chloe and Carson, they had to go through it. They each had their tears. They each had their pain. They each were coming up to me when I was in pain, and they're patting me on the shoulder. Dad, we love you. We know this isn't true. It's going to be okay. Jesus is going to take care of you. And those kinds of things were the things that I was saying where I should have gone, you know what? My kids should not be having to see this from me in this sustained way. I should not be seeing this from them. This is a level of darkness and a level of wickedness that I don't need to be waiting for a veto. I need to pull the trigger on this, and we need to get out of here. I didn't see it. I see it now. I saw it with just enough time to do exactly nothing about it. And I think the Lord was in that and knows how to bring good out of evil, whether that evil was nasty people out there or whether that was my mistake.
Okay, that's really helpful. All right, last question for this week. There are people who are listening to this podcast who have unrestored relationships who desire restoration. Mm-hmm. At the end of the podcast, you talk about how that's a part of your story right now. Mm-hmm. There are people that you want to have a restored relationship with. It is on the table, and it's just not been taken up. Mm-hmm. what encouragement would you give to people who are in a similar position to you? They'd say,
Yeah.
"Oh, I relate with that. I've got this unrestored relationship. I want it back so bad, but I can't have it."
Yeah.
What encouragement would you give them?
So I love when the Bible says in Romans chapter 12 that if possible, insofar as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So every phrase in that passage is important. If possible, insofar as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So if possible, sometimes it's not possible. In a fallen world, sometimes it's just not going to be possible. One of the reasons why that is true is because the next phrase, insofar as it depends on you. Relationships are broken because of two people, not just one. That means it's going to take two sides of the relational coin to be restored, not just one. So you have to do whatever it depends on you to do to live at peace with all men. So as far as I know, and listen, I'm recording this podcast, so everybody can listen to this podcast. I can be held accountable so many different ways. I'm not trying to sneak anything under the radar. This is happening in the broad light of day. I'm not trying to hide or cover up anything. There are people who would say, I'm listening to this guy. You asked me a question about it last week. I'm listening to this guy, and I know this. I know he did stuff wrong. And I would say, okay, I admit it. I did stuff wrong. We got people who write stuff about me online, and literally our last communication, I can prove it to you on email. Our last communication is, if you are upset, can we please meet about this? Can we please be reconciled about it? And they don't ever write back to me to be reconciled. They don't ever schedule a meeting to get together. They go online and they say stuff. We talked about, I have got, from some people, the last communication I have from them is, we are going to sue you. And the last communication they have from me is, could we please be reconciled? Listen, that is, if it's possible, insofar as it depends on you, you got to live at peace with all people. There are some folks who don't want peace. Some folks love the fight. Some folks are so committed to a lie that they will never let it go. And so what you have to do is be a person who loves Jesus and relationship more than whatever these ministries have to offer, whether money or power or prestige or whatever it is. You have to love Jesus and relationship more than what these things have to offer. And so you just make clear that that's what you want. I want our relationships to be restored. And then if that offer is not received, then you have done what it depends on you to live at peace with all people. If you're listening to this, I'm telling you, if you're listening to this and you don't like me, you got something against me, or you think I've got something against you, listen. If the whole reason for this podcast is to have the next to last week be something that I could say that would lead to us being restored, I'd be thrilled. And so this is me saying, you've got my email. You have got my contact information. Reach out. Let's be restored. Relationships are what matter. The kingdom is what matters, not some kind of conflict about something that in 1 trillion years is not going to matter. Mm-hmm. So I think what it is your responsibility to do is to endeavor to live peaceably, to put that offer out there, to try insofar as you can, and then you've got to let it go. Spencer, how hard this has been for me. You're part of the group of people who've had to tell me stop, because there are people who even since this podcast started, I have wanted to reach out and say, listen, I see you are putting this stuff online. Can we please resolve this matter? And you guys tell me, Heath, you can't do that. Your last communication is, let's be reconciled. Let's be restored. But they're spending all their energy putting stuff online, not trying to. So that what they want is not to make it right. What they want is for this to go on. And so it's hard for me because I don't understand that, and I wish it weren't so. And so this is where all of us have to trust the Lord. It is a loss. It is a pain. It is an element of suffering. And we need to trust the Lord with that suffering and believe that sooner or later he's going to turn it for good. I would love it. I would love it if in my situation, and I would love it if in your situation, what he would do is restore those relationships so that we could go, look what the Lord did. Look at these broken relationships that were restored. But if he doesn't do it that way, he'll do it in some other way, and he'll get the glory, and it will be good no matter what. And we have to trust him that that's true.
That's helpful. Thank you. Well, that concludes our 6th week of what happened at First Baptist. And we've got one more week left. So next week we'll have our story episode drop on Monday. Just a reminder, please send in your emails. I'm reading each one of them, and I'm trying to craft questions that bring them all together. So send those in at whathappened@fbcjax.com. And until next Monday, we will see you then.